Alright guys, so it's Christmas Eve, but the economic war is not taking a break. As we all prepare for the new year, the West is also taking stock of their plans for 2025. Trump is preparing a trade war with China. The EU as a whole is still resisting cooperation with Beijing, but the UK, like Italy and Spain, is starting to wake up to the truth. There's no surviving this chaos without the Chinese economy, and it's quite a shift. We can recall Starmer confronting President Xi about human rights at the G20 summit. But there's now a big pivot to Beijing. It's a big 180 out of nowhere. The UK is running to China in January next month. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, is scrambling to build stronger economic ties. Trump has won and his global trade is coming. His global trade war is coming. Europe has been threatened with buying more US oil and gas, and Starmer's afraid the UK is going to be next on the list. It won't surprise you that I'm not a big fan of tariffs, and therefore we have to make sure that we avoid tariffs. And if you're Starmer, there are only a few avenues you have to tariff-proof your economy. Sure, Europe is your biggest trading partner, and in a peaceful world, it makes complete sense to deepen cooperation there. And on paper, this looks like the winning move. 42% of UK exports heads to the EU, and over 50% of all UK imports comes from Europe as well. So the dependency is enormous. It can't be understated, but let's project the fate of Europe in the next 4 years. If the EU is forced to buy expensive energy from the US, well, what would that mean? The cost of manufacturing would increase. The UK will be importing more expensive stuff and trying to sell to an impoverished economic bloc. And to get the UK out of its slump and stagnation, they have to reverse their trade policies. Brexit has done a nasty number on the British economy, especially on their exports. It's important we quantify the devastation done to British companies. As a result of Brexit, the UK suffered a £27 billion hit to their exports in 2022. Small companies collapsed, and over 16,000 firms quit exporting to the EU. Now, this chart shows an ominous trend. Smaller companies in the UK saw an incredible drop in exports of up to 40%. Now, bigger companies might be doing better, but the overall trend is still heading down. And with Trump's trade war coming, the UK can't just rely on Europe any longer. Trump wants NATO as a whole to contribute 5% of GDP to defense, and that money has to come from somewhere. Money going to defense spending probably means buying US weapons and gear. Let's get realistic about that. And that's not productive for the EU or the UK economy. Europe will be too broke to increase trade. And that's why, like many other EU countries, the UK has to run to China, the only economy that's growing and decoupling from the US at the same time. And watch what they do and not what they say. It pays to look at the UK's trading relations. Now, the US, of course, is their single biggest trading partner, over 100 billion in imports and exports. But China is the UK's emergency card in the event of a trade war. Chinese imports are close second at 56 billion pounds. And we know China exports deflation, so the UK needs those cheap goods, especially if they plan to counter tariff the US. Exports collectively is at number 2. Now, the UK sold only 21 billion worth to the Chinese mainland, but let's not forget about Hong Kong at 10 billion pounds. Hong Kong is still part of China. China as a whole is the second biggest importer of UK goods, so you can see the dependence Britain has on the Chinese consumer as well. This is the advantage of China's decoupling. They are breaking away from the US and they are building up their own consumer market. And this makes it very attractive for countries trying to hedge against the US in 2025. If the Americans hammer us in trade, we can retaliate and we'll just buy and sell more in the Chinese economy. And this is not an isolated event, it's going to become the prevailing trend. It's not a surprise that the UK is making a silent pivot. We should trade and seek investment when it's our national interest to do so. Suddenly, the narrative of China supporting Russia seemed to have vanished. But perhaps it also has to do with the collapse of the UK auto industry. Maybe, just maybe, they also want help from Chinese EV companies. The British auto industry is plunging. There are even plans to close the Vauxhall plant in Luton. A historic Stellantis factory might be going under, which echoes the situation going on in Germany. Production costs in the UK, like in Europe, are just too expensive. The technology, especially electric vehicles, is years behind China as well. UK output has plunged by 30% from a year earlier, and this marks 9 months of continuous decline, from 1.8 million cars in 2017 to under 900 grand in just 7 years. So someone has to fill in the gap. If Trump wants to relocate manufacturing back to the US and force Europe to buy expensive energy, it can spark an industrial crisis. Having Chinese companies come in might be the only contingency plan left. So 2025 is going to be extremely messy for the UK. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the final salvo by the Biden administration. And once again, it's a pretty desperate attempt to slow China's semiconductor industry. However, it tells us the chip wars aren't over yet, and it's going to continue during Trump's regime. The US is now targeting China's legacy semiconductors. Now, the argument, as usual, is overcapacity. Beijing is once again trying to take over the global chip market. Now, there are chips needed for cars, computers, TVs, weaponry, and even washing machines. Now, they are the older versions that are generations away from AI chips. The US has already limited Chinese imports of both advanced chips and chip makers. Companies like ASML and Tokyo Electron can't sell their best gear to China. But targeting legacy chips is going to put Beijing on high alert. It's going to make the prices of everything fly to the moon. China's share of mature chips is over 30% today, and by 2027, it's going to reach 39% of global production. So whether you're buying an EV, TV, or laptop, chances are the chips inside are made in China. And when China corners an industry, they go all out. Just like solar panels, China drives down the cost of manufacturing and they ramp up production to grab more market share. By 2030, China is projected to build enough fabs to crank out 50 million 12-inch wafers annually. That's more than the US, EU, and Taiwan combined. So the ability to compete for the West is slipping away fast. And that's why we have Biden trying to punish legacy chips now. When you can't compete, trade barriers start to come up. You isolate your economy from Chinese imports to hopefully build up your own capacity. Now, according to Raimondo, semiconductor companies are hesitant to invest in the US. Why? Because Chinese suppliers are selling their chips at 30 to 50% lower than US providers. And that's the supply chain advantage Beijing has. They have cheaper energy and they control the mineral inputs. Producing in China and shipping it all the way to the US is still cheaper. So we can see the playbook. Tariffs on Chinese legacy chips are coming. Now maybe it's 50%, maybe it's 100%, maybe it's 200%. It's the only option the US has left if Trump wants to reshore production back home. However, this will lead to a bifurcation of markets. Countries that can access affordable chips and those that tariff Chinese imports. Now, by 2030, electronics would account for half of a car's total cost, and in EVs, there are at least 3,000 semiconductors, including mass produced chips. So, Americans buying cars will be paying more. The chips will be made in the US for sure, but domestic prices would most definitely be higher, while other countries like those in Asia will be paying less. And that, ladies and gentlemen, would be the immediate cause of a tariff war. Two distinct markets, one for countries that still trade with China, and the US market that's going isolationist. Now, a shift in global trade is just a start. As China trades less with the US, something obvious is also going to happen. Chinese merchants will be transacting less in dollars, and as a byproduct, China will have a lesser need to hold dollar reserves, which should be a very big wake up call. China's holdings of US bonds have once again dropped to a record low. They now hold only $760 billion in US debt, and that's a 37 billion reduction in holdings even as bond prices recover. So China is either letting their holdings mature and roll off, or they're actively selling. And going forward, we can expect this number to drop even further. And this presents a serious problem for the US economy going forward. Reshoring is a very expensive exercise, and let's recall what happened just a week ago. While the Federal Reserve cut rates, Powell has signaled fewer reductions in 2025, so we might get only one or two cuts maximum next year. The Trump administration will be issuing bonds when borrowing costs are still crazy high. Sure, there will always be demand from the Western world. G7 countries, they'll still be net buyers. But the more China expands their bilateral trade with BRICS, overall global demand will continue to slip. And if we look at the Treasury yield curve, something disturbing is happening. The blue curve shows yields in September. The 2-year yield was 3.6%. The 10-year yield was also around 3.6, but yields have started to go higher across the longer end of the curve. The 10-year bond now yields over 4.5%. The 10-year sets the benchmark of every other borrowing rate in the US. So companies today are still getting clobbered with higher interest rates. Having foreign buyers for US treasuries is important. It's going to be interesting to see how Trump is going to drive more demand. Threatening tariffs won't work because that reduces trade and as a result, the flow of dollars. Plus, Beijing is starting to issue their own stash of dollar denominated bonds as well. The demand they are getting is almost on par with the US, and this is going to throw a wrench into Washington's funding plan. If the Chinese continues to borrow dollars from the world, this will push yields higher directly across the board. Buyers will demand a higher return. And things keep getting stranger. Chinese investors themselves are buying dollars bonds more issued by the Chinese government. And let me repeat that. Beijing is selling dollar bonds to their own people to prevent money from flowing to the US. They want to keep the cash in house. This incredible demand drove yields on China's dollar bonds below those issued by the Treasury. In other words, Beijing could borrow US dollars at a cheaper rate than the US government. And that's how crazy things have become. So big shifts are happening. 2025 is going to get more wow. Western countries are beginning to peel away one by one. US sanctions are also getting more desperate. China is also finding new ways to shake up the dollar system. Things will never be the same again. But before I go, I want to wish everyone here a merry and a blessed Christmas. To enjoy the holidays and really have a good one with the family. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.